Welcome to Module 1 Highlights. So when I look over your work every week, I learn a lot because my definition of learning is coming to see something in a new way. And a lot of your responses will spur me to kind of see something a little bit differently. And often I get excited about that and I want to share what I've learned from you. Also, sometimes I want to highlight certain ideas or misconceptions and such. So please make sure to watch these. At the very end, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer that question in the discussion that's going to be underneath this video in Canvas. All right, so just to start off, just briefly, I couldn't figure out why, there were only 3 people who did Flipgrid, and I was like, why didn't anyone do Flipgrid? And then I realized that I made the due date October 23rd. Please don't forget to do this. Maybe I'll just add it to Module 2. Just make sure that you get that done. I meant to have it due the same week, but no biggie. All right, so I looked a lot at your Edpuzzle responses on definitions of teaching and learning, and I want to highlight a few and talk about them. So Manuel wrote, a teacher attempts to distribute knowledge that's perceived to be important for the teacher. The learner understands that information, processes it, stores it, and can apply it. Right? Effective teachers are able to explain the same information in different ways to help those with different learning abilities. And then they have measuring evaluating tools to make sure the information was actually learned. Okay, so this is a really good definition. This comes from a cognitivist perspective. And you should have in your reading looked a little bit about different learning theories. Cognitivist is kind of like, the Pixel movie, with the little girl. Let me pause it while I remember it. Okay, I knew once I paused it, I remember it. Inside Out, where they show the little people talking in the girl's head and they have the files and memories they store downstairs. That's a very cognitivist perspective, and it's very common, and it's a good way to describe learning. Here's from Roberto. Teaching is when someone, a teacher, teaches or supports others for them to learn. The best way to teach is to let them, the students, learn by themselves and simply facilitate their understanding. So we have a different perspective here. The teacher isn't giving the information into their head and then evaluating it. They're supporting the students doing their own learning. That is another good way. This is a little more of a constructivist perspective, right? So both these ways are valid, and it helps us to kind of think about different pieces of this. And here's Kale. Kale wrote, learning is the act. So he kind of brings in this active and the passive. Active and passive response to outside stimulus. It shapes our worldview and self-view. It's deeply integrated into the human condition of curiosity and social responsiveness. That was just a really interesting description for me. I especially like this idea of social responsiveness and curiosity. This means that learning has a social element, right? So we're not just memorizing information. There's something about how we interact with other people that is important as part of learning. So I want to show you, talk a little bit more in Flipgrid, which I'm sure a lot of you are going to do this week. I ask you to share a metaphor for learning. And here's some examples of some different types of metaphors for learning. So I'm just going to focus here. Like, we can talk about learning as receiving knowledge, and knowledge becomes an object and the mind's a container that we put that knowledge in. It could also be building understandings or a builder. It can be participating. It can be growth or creative construction. And then that goes with different experiences of the teacher. The teacher can have different types of learning metaphors as well. So just to make this easier, I'm going to follow the example of Anna Svard, whom I think there was an optional reading by her in Canvas, and talk about 2 main types of teaching metaphors. So one is this acquisition, and this is the more cognitivist, where we're going to acquire, gain, take in information. The teacher delivers and gives knowledge. So that's how, at least in the United States, we generally think of learning as memorizing and giving knowledge. But that's not the only way we learn, and it can be really beneficial to also think of this participation metaphor. And participation is when it's more constructivist. It's when we're discovering knowledge. The teacher becomes a guide. They set up the structure for the student to learn. Okay, so this is, like I said, this is from this article by Anna Svard. We're looking at acquisition and participation, and they're both really good. Now, I want to add to this a little bit. Isaac, I don't have the screenshot here, but he had brought up some things about gender and racial inequality and what that has to do with learning. And that's a critical perspective. And so I want to talk a little bit about the knowledge acquisition metaphor and where sometimes it can get into trouble, especially when we're talking about equity. Okay? So, first of all, just one reason this is important is if we think all learning is just acquiring, someone just gives us information and we just take it in, that's where we start having problems with things like fake news. Because we're just teaching people to take in everything they hear or see or read and not to think critically. And usually what happens is people accept the things that already align with what they already believe and then just ignore everything else because they don't know how to incorporate that into their own understandings and how to really critically evaluate it. And so when we're talking about acquisition, sometimes it can lead to problems like we have with fake news. So if I add my 2 cents, I want to add into this conversation this idea of social justice and how that goes along with teaching, learning, and technology, and the metaphors for learning. So if we talk this guy named Paul Freire, he was a famous, I think he was from, I'm having a lot of blank mind, somewhere in South America. And he was a scholar and really focused on equity in learning. And so he talked about 2 models of education. So the first one he called the banking model. And that's when we put information into a bank, right? The teacher is giving information, the students are taking it in. And that's very much a cognitivist perspective. He also had this what he called the problem posing, and that's when people are actually exploring, analyzing, and questioning ideas. And so ultimately, of these 2 models, he was really a fan of problem posing. He kind of said there's some problems with this banking model. And I don't know that it's entirely bad, but let me tell you what he said, what Freire said. He said that when we're talking about a banking model of education, we are just whoever's in power is just putting their ideas into the heads of others. And then they just have to accept it. They just accept the status quo and they keep doing the things that they've always done. So it's kind of like this comic here where this guy right here, he's just giving the same, his own information, his own seeing everything as orange. He's just making all the others seeing everything as orange. And that's what it means to be real, is if it's orange. But what if some of his ideas and seeing things orange is more beneficial to some gender or racial groups than others, right? What if what he's seeing is that men have power and so he's just continually we're just passing that on and on and on. That can perpetuate inequity. So that's why sometimes you have to be careful with this acquisition model, because it means that whoever's in power can just put their knowledge in someone else's head and keep the status quo. Okay? So there's something called critical pedagogy, and this is pushing against this. So where traditional practice, we're going to look at classroom management, skill development. Critical pedagogy looks a lot deeper at human beings, that human element of learning, their needs and contexts and histories. They look more holistic, and it's actually kind of political and multidimensional. And then we have the word digital, if we add some technology to critical digital pedagogy. And that is where we say we need to have open and networked educational environments. And this means that when someone's learning, they need to have access to information beyond just what one teacher is telling them, because they need to expand and not get stuck in the status quo. says there must be platforms for engaging students and teachers as full agents of their own learning. They're becoming agents. They're guiding their own learning and pulling in their power that way. All right. So once again, when we look at these phrases, this doing participation in the process, this participation metaphor for learning has the potential to fight some of these inequities, right? Now, that does not mean that I think acquisition is bad. I think sometimes that's totally appropriate, but I also think it's important to think in both ways. To try, if you're always thinking in acquisition, try it on. Try thinking about learning as participating and discovering and see what happens. All right, I won't always make my highlight videos this long, but this was an important topic for me to cover. Reach out this week if you have questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing all your work. Thanks.